behavior change technology, I'm going to walk through a few behavior change models that you're probably familiar with, and then I want to actually go through sort of like a case example and talk about the application of that to nutrition, because I think that's probably the biggest issue that's facing sort of America today, and how I sort of got started with my new company. So just to give a little bit of background on the way too many things that I do. So by training, I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. My specialty is in behavioral medicine, which is basically the behavioral treatment of medical conditions such as obesity, diabetes. I was talking to someone about insomnia treatment as well. And so the perspective of behavioral medicine is obviously, even though, for instance, diabetes is an issue that's treated by endocrinology, at root, for the majority of people who have it, it comes down to lifestyle. And so how do you apply sort of principles of behavior change to treating the disease in conjunction with working with the endocrinologists that are taking care of sort of the symptomatic focus of the disease. So I continue to exercise my clinical hat as a clinical professor at UCSF in the Department of Psychiatry. I train and supervise the psychiatry residents there in evidence-based treatments such as CBT, which is cognitive behavioral therapy, and ACT, which is acceptance and commitment therapy, is a mindfulness-based form of psychotherapy. I joke I have the best teaching job in the world because I teach the 24th grade. That's unfortunately what grade the residents after 4 years of college, 4 years of med school, and 4 years of residency training. So they're very well-behaved students. And I apply sort of psychotherapy as an executive coach in Silicon Valley. So I work with mostly startup founders and investors in terms of improving their individual well-being and productivity so that they can be effective in the companies that they're running. Yeah, as most of the people in this room who probably work in Silicon Valley, it's a very work-hard culture, and balance is often not something that's prioritized, and so I help people with that as well. What I've been mostly focused on in the last half-decade is a company called Amada Health, which is actually not too far away from here in the financial district. Joined the company very early on when it was a handful of guys in a room over in WeWork on 2nd Street, and then helped the company through basically raising $128 million, grew the company to 300 employees, to basically become the leading company in digital health. So my function was basically running the clinical innovation team. So we helped design the app through behavior change principles that I'm going to talk about tonight. And I also trained and supervised the 115 plus health coaches that we had, as I do with the residents at UCSF. And the thing that I'm actually proud of the most at Amada, I think Amada gets a lot of attention for all the funding and all the other things that are really not important. The thing that I'm proud of is we helped over 100,000 people lose 1 million pounds. That's what the entire mission of the company. And along the way, I published 3 scientific papers that essentially show that the company does help people lose weight through 1, 2, and 3 years out, and gets statistically significant reductions in A1C, or basically a proxy for their blood sugar. And so, we were one of the first companies in digital health to really start with science and establish an evidence base for what we do, which I think is critical. And then in my new endeavor, I started a company totally different than Amada. So Amada is an enterprise health company. So I started a bootstrapped consumer product goods company that develops science-based foods and supplements, which is a departure, but it actually ties in, and I'll tell you why. All right, so let's talk about behavior change models. So raise of hands, how many have read the book, The Power of Habit? Charles, do you think? Yeah, this is a very smart audience, so I won't spend too much time here, but the funny thing is, Mr. Duhigg didn't come up with this. This is really B.F. Skinner, right? So the behaviorists who founded the principles of operant conditioning basically said, well, how does a habit get formed? And it's 3 basic steps in a habit formation loop. So you start with a cue or trigger. So here it's called a reminder that gets someone to start a habit. So that could be like an alarm clock in the morning. That's the trigger. That elicits someone to engage in a routine. You're going to wake up in the morning, start brushing your teeth, start getting ready for your day. And then ideally you're rewarded for that behavior. So that may be being able to do what you want to do in that day, being able to accomplish the things that you want to do. That provides an intrinsic sense of reward. It makes it likely that you're going to continue to engage in that behavior. So this is basically sort of the foundation of establishing a habit. So then Nir et al. Came along and wrote a book called Hooked, and so basically expanded upon that previous model. And it's kind of similar. So the 3 R's, you can see that represented here in the trigger, the action, and the reward. But what I think was nice that Nir did is that he accentuated it a little bit and said, well, it's not just a trigger. There's both an internal trigger and an external trigger. So previously, like in the example of the alarm clock that I gave, that's an external trigger. But he was saying that external triggers don't really work unless it corresponds with an internal trigger of what a person really wants, right? So if you don't want to get out of bed, but the alarm clock's going off, what are you going to do? You're going to hit it, the snooze button, and not get out of bed. But if you're really jonesing to get out and accomplish your day, then the internal trigger corresponds with the external trigger and makes sure that action actually takes place. So when you get up and you go about your day and you're feeling a sense of accomplishment, that's your reward for it. The one other addition that Nir added to the model is the sense of investment, right? So what is like the bit of work that's done that increases the likelihood of returning, right? So this principle is used a lot in social networks, right? We spend a lot of time like grooming and curating our social networks in terms of adding our friends, uploading pictures, and that puts a lot of investment into the app, and so it makes us much more likely for us to return, because if we have to switch, there's user switching costs of going to another network. You have to upload all your friends again, you gotta upload all your pictures, you gotta put your little curated preferences, and so it makes it tougher. So this is a great model as well. And then I actually developed my own, and the reason for that was because I felt like a lot of the models were basically focused on the right side of the screen. So that's basically the habit formation loop that we started with, that Charles Duhigg talked about, in which you start with a reminder, it elicits an action, and then it results in a reward. The other part that I felt, though, that was missing was sort of the left-hand side of it, which is what I call the goal formation loop, right? So habits don't really happen just in a vacuum where you magically just start with a trigger and then the behavior elicits. That's probably a better model for habits that are pre-existing or perpetuating, right? So if it's a habit that's already in place. But when we're talking about behavior change, most people are really interested in, okay, how do I start a behavior, right? Or how do I get a user on my app or a patient of mine in a clinic to change their behavior? And that usually starts with intention setting, right? So if you follow along, basically in the top left corner, it starts with a plan, right? And I think that's the important thing, is there has to be an initial intention that's set when someone's setting their behavior. So, let's say I decide, for instance, that I want to really be good about exercise, right? I've been sort of delaying that, but I know exercise is good for me, and so I start working with a personal trainer and decide that I want to exercise. I'm going to use my SMART goal setting Monday, Wednesday, Fridays at 7:30 in the morning. All right, so that's my goal. And so Monday morning, I wake up, I'm really jazzed, and I go to the gym and I act on it. And so the reward that I feel an intrinsic sense of accomplishment for doing that. I probably feel physiological reward as well, in terms of my endorphins are going, and I'm feeling good from doing that. So oftentimes, that's why the first time that we elicit an action, we're likely to accomplish it because our motivation, our levels are high. But the second time, the third time, the subsequent times that we engage in the behavior, it's very hard to rely on motivation long term. And so that's why we need to start incorporating things like reminders for us to make sure that behavior change is something that perpetuates in the long term, right? So let's imagine on Tuesday night, I remember, okay, my intention was to wake up again Wednesday morning and go to the gym for that second time. Now I'm going to use a reminder for that, right? And so maybe I'll add a little bit of cue. So I'll prepare my gym bag, I'll put my shoes in the gym bag, I'll put it right next to my bed when I'm leaving my apartment, and that way that's going to be my cue or my reminder that it's time to go to the gym. And then I'll act on it again. That's awesome. Second time this week, I've accomplished my goal. I feel a sense of reward for continuing to do that. And then Thursday night, I do it again. I set my alarm, set my gym bag out. But the problem is, it's the end of the work week. I'm really tired from a long week of work, and I'm getting a little bit of sleep deprived from the hours that I've been working. And what happens Friday morning, where my alarm goes off, but I'm so tired, I'm like, you know what? I'm going to skip the gym this morning. right? And this is how often behavior change habits get broken, right? Is people do start them for certain periods of time, some stressor happens or some interruption happens, and then people sort of fall out of the loop. And so the important thing here is that I think behavior change shouldn't be thought of as like a simple loop where it just perpetuates forever. That's great for like a long-term habit, but if you're talking about actually creating a new habit that is not really solidly in place or has a lot of other things that are competing for someone's attention, then that's where you need to bring in sort of the goal loop. And so at the end of that week, on the weekend, I think about and I reflect on how did that week go? Right, so I said, okay, not bad. I set out to work out 3 days this week, but I actually only did 2 days. Now, why was that? What got in the way, right? And so I look back on the week and I said, well, yeah, it was because I was tired at the end of the week, and who isn't tired on a Friday morning? As I mentioned, I was kind of overworked, maybe a little bit sleep deprived. So was it realistic for me to try to work out at 7:30 on a Friday? Maybe not, right? And so I'm going to loop back up into the planning aspect of it and say, okay, for week number 2, I'm going to change my goal. Right? I still want to work out 3 days a week, but what I'm going to do is work out Monday and Wednesday at 7:30, but on Friday I'm going to work out after work because it's just too much work Friday morning to get up early and go to work. So I'm going to allow myself to sleep in a little bit more, shift that third intention, that third workout to later in the afternoon, right? And so that makes it much more likely for that 3-day-a-week goal to perpetuate. Right? And so I wrote about this in an article. I was talking about basically how do you use human intelligence and how to use artificial intelligence and combine them in order to elicit behavior change, particularly if you're designing behavior change products. And so the argument that I sort of made is that the left-hand side of the screen, the goal formation loop, is really better handled by human intelligence. Right? Because you really have to ask the individual user, what's your goal? Not the goal that the clinician wants for you, not the goal that your parents want for you, not the goal that the app wants for you, but what are you realistically willing to do? For a lot of people, working out 3 days a week may be too much. For other people, it may be too little. That's a really idiosyncratic thing. And it also changes, right? Based on your schedule, based on your mood, maybe even based on the season right now, right? Daylight savings has happened. It's a lot earlier. Maybe right now you don't want to work out at 6 o'clock because it's dark outside, right? And if you're the kind of person who runs along the Embarcadero, that may not be as good a goal as it was in the summertime, right? And so the other thing that humans and clinicians are pretty good at is reflecting, right? And getting insight into why people fail at behavior change, right? So an app would have a hard time recognizing that, okay, maybe from Monday to Thursday I'm losing about 20 minutes of sleep every single night, and my fatigue levels are going up, and that's the reason why just, Fridays are a tough day for me, right? But if someone was coaching someone through that, or someone was just journaling themselves, they would have the insight to be able to recognize that. Now, where artificial intelligence, I believe, is really good is on the right-hand side of the screen, right? So this is where software comes in, this is where AI comes in, which is, reminders obviously, can be automated, right? We use alarm clocks, we use push notifications, we use text messages, we use all of these things. They actually work pretty well. And actually, reward, surprisingly, also can be automated as well. Obviously, there's a huge value to social reward, right? There's nothing like someone telling you that you did a good job in the social reinforcement. But quite frankly, if you look at things like gaming, which I'm going to talk about, people can play games in an automated system for hours, right? Just because they're getting badges, they're getting points, they're getting a sense of accomplishment. All of that can be automated through AI and through computer technology as well. And so I think where we're at in terms of technology, you can sort of use both the soft touch in terms of the human component on the left side of the screen, and you can use the automated AI touch as well, and combine those in order to get people to change their behavior. And I think if you really want to get people to change their behavior in the long run, you have to get people to iterate on their behaviors on a regular basis and figure out why it's not going well and how they can get back on the wagon. And no behavior change model that doesn't take that into account is really going to help people change their behaviors in the long term, right? And so the funny thing is, a lot of people here work on products in the Valley. All we do is use lean startup methodology and iterate on our products, right? And so why wouldn't we do that on ourselves, right? If you're talking about people, they basically need to be iterating on their behavior change product on a daily basis. So I'll talk about some of the most effective behavior change technology. In my opinion, the two most effective examples of behavior change technology out in the wild are social networking and gaming. So I tried to look up actually the data on this. Social networks like Facebook actually own, for the average user, 50 minutes a day. 50 minutes. And then if you're a gamer, probably one of the most popular mobile games out there is Candy Crush Saga. I won't ask you to raise your hand and admit that you play that game, but you know who you are. If you do, that owns 35 minutes of your day. And so, is that a lot? So I tried to come up with some comparators and say, okay, well, let's compare this to health behaviors and figure out if that's a lot. The average person spends 17 minutes a day exercising, spends 4 minutes a day on social events like coming to this, and 64 minutes a day eating and drinking. So people spend 85 minutes a day on Facebook and Candy Crush. That's the same amount of time exactly that they're spending exercising, at social events, and eating and drinking. That's remarkable, right? So in terms of mind share, we are literally spending more time on social networking, gaming, versus these basic health behaviors. And really that shows how effective it is, right? So people have spent a lot of time, a lot of money figuring this out. And my kind of perspective is if you are designing an app that is a behavior change app, and you're optimizing for DAU, or daily active use, right? The goal of your app is to get people to log in on a daily basis and use it. If it does not look like a social network, or it does not look like a game, you are probably doing it wrong. Because these are the two most powerful examples of behavior change technology, and I think it's probably the two best ways, at least if you want to get people to do it on a daily basis. If it's something different, they only need to log in on a weekly basis, maybe a monthly basis, it doesn't need to look like these. But if you want daily usage, that's probably the best tactic that you can take. And this is exactly what we did at Omada, right? So if you're familiar with Omada's product, it's essentially a private online social network. It puts about 24 of your BFFs in a social network that's demographically matched for your age and your location and your BMI. So people that you look at on the screen and you're like, okay, I don't know these people in real life, but I can relate to them because they look like me, they have the same problem as me, and we're working on it together, right? And so we basically leverage, I call it social networking for good, in order to get people to change. And I don't know if you saw this news tidbit recently. Sean Parker, who was the ex-president of Facebook and played by Justin Timberlake in the movie The Social Network, has actually become very cynical about Facebook. So I want to read this quote. And when he was talking about developing Facebook, he said the objective was, how do we consume as much of your time and conscious attention as possible? Right, direct quote. It was this mindset that led to the creation of features such as the like button that would give users a little dopamine hit to encourage them to upload more content. It's a social validation feedback loop, exactly the kind of thing that a hacker like myself would come up with because you're exploiting a vulnerability in human psychology. It literally changes your relationship with society, with each other. It probably interferes with productivity in weird ways. God only knows what it's doing to our children's brains, right? So easier said than done when you're a billionaire, and now you're feeling a little bit guilty about what you created, but it's true, right? So even the people who literally created this technology realize how powerful it is, and so I think the important thing that I want to insert here is that there should be more and more thought about the ethics of applying behavior change technology, because when it's done well, it quite frankly is addictive. I don't think there's any argument about that. And so the nice thing is that at least if you're in digital health, we're trying to apply that for positive benefit as well.
You know the news today? That the more time spent on Facebook is associated in teenagers with increased risk of suicide.
Yeah, not surprising, right? There's interesting research that's been done. It's ecological momentary assessment research. It's just basically a fancy term for real-time sampling, right? So if you ping people throughout the day and you ask people, what are they doing? How much do they enjoy doing that? And like, how meaningful is it, right? Does it substantially improve the quality of your life? People spend a lot of time on Facebook, but when you actually ask people about it, they're not super happy when they're on it, and it certainly doesn't contribute to their meeting, right? So it's a little bit of an incongruous behavior, and I think it's literally just because of the dopamine hit, right? So finally, BJ Fogg, who's at Stanford, has his own behavior model. I think about this less as a sort of a comprehensive behavior change model, but I think it's a little bit more of a very clever model for explaining what's the likelihood that any given behavior actually is going to happen on a given day. So it's a good predictor of a behavior. And so he basically says that the likelihood of a behavior happening is equal to someone's motivation times their ability times the trigger, right? So it's kind of like a math equation that he came up with. And so on the left axis is the motivation from low to high. On the bottom axis is someone's ability from sort of, is it hard to do or is it easy to do? And he was saying that if you kind of take these two variables, you can kind of predict about how likely it is that someone's going to engage in the behavior, right? So let's take the example that I gave earlier in this talk about, getting up early in the morning and working out, right? So if you don't have a lot of motivation to work out and it's super early and you're tired, no matter how good that trigger is, how good that alarm clock is, the likelihood that trigger is going to work is very, very low, right? That's that bottom left corner. Now, if it's an easy behavior, right? It's easy to do, you're highly motivated to do it. Maybe it's just like, send a text to your significant other telling them you care about them. You obviously care about that person. 5-second behavior, top right corner, very easy to do. Now, the hard part is when it comes to behaviors that are sort of in the middle, right? When your motivation is sort of medium and your ability to do it is sort of medium. And in the example I gave earlier about working out, that's probably a good example. Maybe on Monday and Wednesday, for me, maybe waking up and going to the gym is a moderately difficult thing to do, right? And so as long as my motivation is moderately high, the likelihood of me doing that behavior, according to this little chart, is above that green action line and it's likely to happen, right? But what happened on Friday, right? Friday I was tired, my motivation level dropped, and so by virtue of this model, because my ability is moderate but my motivation is low, it's below sort of the action threshold, and thus the sleep button, the snooze button goes and I don't go to the gym, right? And so I actually think this is very useful for thinking about how we build products, because the majority of the products that I see in digital health focus on the left side of the screen, which is how do we motivate people to engage in health behaviors, right? And use coaching, use notifications, use all kinds of technology. And there's not enough apps and technology that's focused on how do we actually just make it easier for people to do the right thing. That's, I think, actually the missing piece. If you actually talk to BJ Fogg, he says that too. He's like, if you really want to change people's behavior, just make it easier for them to do the behavior, right? This is the big, I think, uncharted territory that's been neglected, but I think also has the most potential. The challenge is a lot of the apps that we develop, and a lot of the apps that are out there, even if they would do a lot of good for people, are basically asking people to do work. And maybe from a logical perspective, which is, yes, if you change all your health behaviors and it'll profoundly improve your quality of life, it would be beneficial. But asking people to do work, and particularly asking people to pay for your app to get them to do work, that's like a double whammy, right? It's like, you pay me money to do all the work yourself, and I'm just going to basically help you in the process. Very, very tough to do. I think people, however, will pay to make their lives easier. So I want to talk a little bit about the application of this. I wrote a series of articles. It's called, I purposely picked the controversial headline, which is The Cure for Obesity is Processed Food. So part 1 and 2 are published. I haven't published part 3 yet, but I'm going to actually go through it here with you, so you get a little bit of a sneak preview before it's published. A colleague of mine at UCSF Medical School, Dr. Robert Lustig, who you may be familiar with, who has really advocated against sugar as sort of being toxic and addictive. He tweeted recently this great quote. He said, "We have a war between two food systems. On the one hand, a traditional diet of real food, and then we have ultra-processed food on the other hand, right? And they're at war with one another." And my response to this was, he's absolutely right, but the part that no one's talking about is that we have lost this war. We've lost the war, right? And why is that? Because another colleague of mine, Dr. Dariush Mozaffarian, he published a research. He's the Dean of Nutrition over at Tufts, and he actually analyzed the standard American diet, or what I call SAD, because it is very sad, and looked at what are people eating, right? So, and if you look at the standard American diet, it is 1/3 unprocessed or whole food, 10% minimally processed food. So minimally processed food are the things that you have been traditionally made for thousands of years, things like cheese and butter that you could theoretically hand make. And then you have 57% of the American diet is ultra-processed food. So these are basically factory-made foods that you could not make in your own kitchen, right? So like cheese is a minimally processed food. A Cheez-It is an ultra-processed food. And 2/3 of the American diet is basically processed food. And so what do we do as clinicians, right? Or even in these diet books that are out there, we tell people, okay, let's go back to the ideal American diet of eating 100% whole, unprocessed food. And that is a great ideal, And if you can do it, God bless you. But I think it's a completely unrealistic expectation, at least for the majority of Americans, to go back to a 100% whole food diet. Because I think of processed foods as basically like a technology, right? And that technology is cheaper, tastier, and more convenient than whole foods, and it will always win from a behavioral perspective, right? So the analogy I make is it's kind of like smartphones, right? So I just got this iPhone X today. But I didn't have a cell phone until I was 18. I didn't have a smartphone until 3 years ago, purposefully, because I knew how addictive the technology is as someone who is in the behavior change field. But am I going back to dumb phone? No. And so is the majority of Americans, right? Once you've had a taste of the technology, it's addictive, right? It's incredibly useful. We're never going back to having dumb phones as a society ever. We have to just sort of figure out how do we cope with the technology. And I think it's the same thing with processed food. We're never getting rid of it. It's going to be here. Big food is here to stay. So the question is, okay, well, if it's here to stay, what do we do with it? And, you know, when in the field of psychology, when we work with sort of difficult or treatment-resistant patients, sometimes we use what are called paradoxical interventions, where you sort of prescribe the problem itself. And so there's an old saying that sometimes the poison is the cure, and I think that's true in this case. So when I published this article, actually one of the commentators on LinkedIn, this is a caveat, by the way, if you post on my articles, it's fair game for me to talk about you in a talk. So this is actually from this morning. So they posted a comment that said, well, the cure for obesity is less carbs and eating less and moving more. It's literally that easy. I lost 12 plus waist sizes on, the acronym is calories in, calories out, in keto, referring to the ketogenic diet. And I was like, that's awesome. And you know, this is the common sort of response that I get when I talk about this topic is either I or someone I knew totally transformed their diet, totally transformed their lives and lost a bunch of weight. And if I can do it, then you can do it too. And everyone can do it, right? And I was like, that's a completely unrealistic expectation. Obviously, holistic change is possible on an individual basis. But the funny thing is, that the commenter did point out, why were they 12 weight sizes higher in the first place, right? So even though it's awesome that they were able to change, at some point, being overweight or obese will get the majority of people. 71% of Americans are overweight or obese. If you actually looked at the lifetime prevalence, it'd probably be closer to 80 or 90%, right? So everyone else, literally, majority of people in this room are the exception to the rule, right? So we have to think about, if you care about population health, if you care about public health, you have to think about what interventions are accessible to the masses and actually can be scalable and sustained for the long term. And the argument that I make is that convenience is king, and it's much more sustainable in the long term. So I'll talk about some research behind this. So a very famous clinical trial called the Diabetes Prevention Program, published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2002, was funded by NIH and CDC, and basically looked at 3 different groups of people. These are basically patients with pre-diabetes, so they had high blood sugar levels, but not high enough yet to have diabetes. And in the placebo group, it actually shouldn't even really be called the placebo group. They actually told these people to lose weight. They're like, here's a brochure, you should probably lose weight or else you're gonna get diabetes, and guess what happened? They didn't lose any weight. You can see that in the chart there. The second group got a metformin, which is the gold standard drug for type 2 diabetes. They basically gave it to them a little bit early and said, you're basically on your way, so take this medication. They did lose some weight. They lost about 2% of their body weight on average and kept it off. And then the lifestyle intervention group, which was this comprehensive behavior change program in which people got individual or group-based counseling, taught them about diet, exercise, and other health behaviors, lost about 7% of their body weight. The challenge, however, is you actually track regain all the weight. And you see this time after time in almost all weight loss studies, people regain almost all the weight back. Now again, on an individual basis, there are exceptions to this rule. There's lots of people who will tell you this great success story, they lost 70 pounds and they kept it off. Again, exception to the rule. For the majority of people, they regain the weight back. Now that's not to say the DPP is not effective. It was effective, right? So when they followed up with these people 10 years later, they still reduced their risk for diabetes by 34%, even though they regained most of the weight back. And probably the reason for that is basically that area under the curve, which is for at least half of those years, they did have weight loss. And so you're at least reducing the damage that's happening compared to the placebo group.
Is that chart with the lifestyle intervention, is that with people that follow the DPP maintenance program as well? Or is that just the single intervention?
It was a single intervention, and then there was an unrandomization basically that happened at some point in the study in which everyone had access to the lifestyle intervention. So yeah, I mean, the intervention necessarily didn't continue on for 10 years. It's very hard to do that, right, with traditional interventions. The nice thing, of course, about technology is theoretically you can have an intervention go on for 10 years, or at least have access to the technology. And so sort of the point that I make, unfortunately this is supposed to be an animated GIF, so you can't see that chart changing, but one of the points that I make, although it's a little controversial, is that I think obesity is actually really more behavioral than biological nowadays. But there's data to substantiate that point of view, and the data comes from the CDC, and that's actually what America looked like in 1985. So less than 10%, if you're looking at it on a state-by-state basis, less than 10% of people were obese. So obese is defined as a BMI over 30. Right now, if we fast forward that graph to 2010, basically it would look all red. And so the obesity rate is over 30% right now. And that basically happened in the span of about 25 years. So it's very hard to make an argument that biologically, most of that was driven by genetic factors. It's largely driven by environmental factors, right? And part of that is because we live in an obesogenic environment, right? We have access to really terrible foods, and the combination of that and the fact that basically food is America's favorite narcotic, right? People talk about the opioid epidemic right now, but if you ask people, 38% of adults report that they've overeaten or eaten unhealthy foods in the past month because of stress. People stress eat. Emotional eating is often one of the major drivers of obesity, especially if you, as a clinician, work with people. It's incredibly, incredibly common. So the argument that I make is that the creation of these ultra-processed foods, right, which amounted to 57% of the standard American diet, if you recall, I actually argue that they're designer drugs, and that we're basically hooked to them as Americans. And part of this theory comes out of a colleague of mine named Deirdre Barrett. She teaches at the Harvard Medical School. She wrote a great book, if you're ever interested, called Wasteland, and she talks about sort of the evolutionary basis of why obesity happens. And so she argues about this phenomenon called supernormal stimuli. So this is a great example of supernormal stimuli. So like this bird is evolutionarily wired to take care of eggs that are spotted. And so researchers can come in and basically trick the bird by putting in a fake plastic egg that's bigger and spotted, and the bird, even though it's literally a fake egg, will sit there and take care of it, right? Because it's just primed to think, oh, okay, if it's an egg and it's a spotted, my instincts tell me to take care of it, right? And human beings are actually not that far removed, right? We are wired to crave fats, to crave sweets, and crave salty things, right? Because it provides an important evolutionary purpose of providing us with calories, to provide us with carbohydrates for energy, to provide us with electrolytes. Now the problem is in nature it's very hard to get these things, and so they're scarce, and so whenever we have them, sure, we're going to go grab a honeycomb and eat it, right? But now we have unlimited amounts of sugar, and that's where it gets us in trouble. There's another great article on this in the New York Times called The Extraordinary Science of Addictive Junk Food, where they actually interviewed food scientists who are basically in the business of basically creating ultra-processed foods. And when you actually understand how they're made, you actually think it's not so much of a conspiracy theory that they're designer drugs. So like for instance, take Frito-Lay. They have a $30 million R&D budget. They have 500 plus scientists, right, that are working to create these Frankenfoods. The best example, my favorite example, is actually the Cheeto, which you're all familiar with. It actually has a technology inside of it called vanishing caloric density. So what does vanishing caloric density mean? It basically melts in your mouth so quickly, and this is a quote from one of the scientists in the article, that your brain thinks that there's no calories in it. You can just keep eating it forever, right? It's not an accident. They designed the food to basically melt so quickly that you don't realize how many calories you're taking in, right? It just seems like an innocent little food puff. It's not. So, if processed foods are designer drugs, as I argue, does it mean they're all bad? No, not necessarily. No, the argument that I make is, look, if we're calling them drugs, well, let's look at drugs. Obviously, recreational drugs aren't great for most people's health. But prescription drugs can be life-saving, right? Even though both are addictive, right? So obviously we have an opioid epidemic, but on the other hand, if you're getting surgery, you would definitely want to benefit from anesthesia, right? So the use of a painkiller, it can be very health-promoting or health-hurting depending on the context. And so I think we have to think about sort of processed foods as in the same way, which is the intention for the processing actually matters a lot, which is, are you processing, as I like to say, for health, or are you processing for wealth, right? The unfortunate thing is that most processed foods are optimized for taste and they're optimized for cost, which is how can I make this as tasty and delicious as possible so I can get you to keep buying it, and make it as cheap as possible so I can make the most money off of it, right? That's the unfortunate reality. But the good news is that, I mean, theoretically speaking, processed foods can be optimized for nutrition and convenience as well. It's not very popular right now, but I think it's a growing trend. The other thing I want to mention with processed food is, unfortunately, there's a little bit of what I like to call chemophobia, where people are always very freaked out whenever they see long, unreadable ingredients on ingredient lists. And that's not a bad proxy actually for picking your food, where if you recognize the ingredients and it's a simple ingredient list, we tell this to our patients all the time, that's probably a good indication of picking a healthy food. But it's not a great rule overall, because if you look at chemically a kiwi, this is an all-natural kiwi, that's theoretically the ingredient list. That's in an all-natural kiwi, right? So if you actually break it down on a molecular level, there's tons of amino acids, there's natural preservatives, there's fatty acids, there's naturally occurring colors. So we shouldn't necessarily be afraid of processing. There's sometimes processing is a good thing. I mean, ideally we would live in a world where we ate fresh food all the time, but if you're having food that's preserved, there's a reason people put preservatives in it, because you're probably going to ingest some mold or fungus that's going to be 10 times worse for you if you get sick than some amount of preservatives. So everything is a balance. But I think there's hope in that, there's actually a Gary Taubes article that came out recently about sugar, and he interviewed someone who, I think they're like an epidemiologist, so someone who's basically working in the obesity field. And the quote was really striking because they basically said that the chances of us winning the war on obesity is about 0%. They're like, virtually nil. We have absolutely no hope of winning the war. And that was very sad to read. It was very sobering to read. And so it makes one feel very hopeless. And I have a little bit of a different view, and I do think that obviously we're not going to turn this around overnight, given that 71% of the population is overweight or obese. But I do think the strategy that we're using is kind of hopeless, right? If we just keep on doing what we're currently doing, which is just pushing individual responsibility and telling people eat right and exercise, yes, that's probably fruitless. That's not to say that individual responsibility is not important, of course it is, but we can't just expect people to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and do it alone. And I think the best precedent, if we have any sort of hope of sort of turning this tide around, is to take a lesson from big tobacco, right? And if you look at it a few decades ago, when smoking was a lot more popular, I think people sort of felt equally hopeless, right? Which is like, we're never going to get rid of smoking or cigarettes. It's so endemic in our society. But I think some major things happened, and one of them was, when the tobacco executives got up in front of Congress and they shamefully sort of testified that nicotine is not addictive, despite all the scientific evidence to the contrary. There's all these lawsuits that happened, and it did two things. One, it put a lot of public funding for public education, and also, legally, we tax tobacco, right? So the price of cigarettes, like when I was growing up, you could get a pack of cigarettes for $1. Right now in California, it costs $10 a pack to smoke cigarettes, so literally a 10x increase. And so if you're a smoker, you're now paying thousands of dollars for your habit. Now, obviously, that's not a panacea for everyone, but it's just significantly is an economic deterrent for that behavior. And economic deterrents, quite frankly, are effective. The other part of it, though, was social. So it's interesting to see sort of how social opinion about smoking has changed, too. In 2004, Match.com, the dating app, did a survey and they asked people, how many of you would absolutely not date a smoker? So back then it was 22%. That's increased to 58% in 2017. It's only 13 years, right? And you're seeing basically a doubling of people who would say, boy, if you engage in that habit, this is going to basically interfere with your reproductive fitness, which is probably, as a human being, finding a mate is probably one of the most important drives in life. And then another 22% said probably not, actually. So if you combine those two, that basically means that the tide of public opinion has basically turned where 80% of Americans basically disapprove to the point that you're not getting a date of smokers, right? The funny thing is there's actually now dating sites that are just for smokers because they're marketing and they're like, I can't get a normal date, right? So I think when you hit that 80% mark, that's when you know you've had a real social change where you are kind of marginalized if you engage in that habit. And I think that's a huge win, right? So what has that actually resulted in? If you look at the state of California where we live, from 1988 to 2014, smoking rates were cut in half. So it decreased from 24% to 12%. Now that still means 1 in 10 people are smoking, but I think that's a huge win when you see that 50% decrease. And so my perspective is let's do what we did with big tobacco and do it with food. So it's not a crazy idea to use economic incentives when it comes to food. We've had the SNAP system in the US, more commonly known as food stamps, for 50 years. But the funny thing about food stamps is you can purchase soft drinks, you can buy candy, cookies, snack crackers, and ice cream with it. Why? Now, a lot of people say, well, you're impeding on, freedom of choice, and certainly the big food companies don't want that to be repealed because it subsidizes their purchases. But there's really no good reason for it. The funny thing is if you look at sort of the political wins right now, Bernie Sanders has been promoting Medicare for all, right? That healthcare is a fundamental human right. And I actually argue that basic food probably should be a fundamental human right for everyone too. There probably should be SNAP for all. And in my opinion, the way that would best work is if we basically subsidize produce to some extent, subsidize minimally processed food, and with some very careful screening, certain healthy ultra-processed foods. And so there's been some economic modeling of what would happen basically if you started applying behavioral economics to food. So this is a research study that basically predicted you could save about 200,000 lives over the next 15 years if you paid for a national education campaign around food, if you taxed sugar-sweetened beverages like soda by 10%, if you gave a 10% subsidy, fruit and vegetables, and if you're a food stamp user, if you give them a 30% subsidy on fruit and vegetables to encourage them to buy it. That combined policy, which is those right bars on the right, would basically save 200,000 lives, right? So obviously though, changing politics is hard, but hopefully with the right representation and voting for and supporting these policies, it can go a long way. But short of political change, well, what can we do a little bit more on a micro level? And I think, given a lot of us work for corporations, there's a lot we can do locally in terms of organizations. And similar to the question that I had about SNAP is, why do private organizations subsidize unhealthy food, right? My brother works for Google. I've been to their offices. They literally have bottles of Coca-Cola and M&Ms all over the place, right? And I think it's great that they subsidize healthy food too. They have salad bars, you get free breakfast, lunch, dinner. But the unhealthy food is just as prevalent. And I've heard some people there, they'll talk and say, well, we make it a little bit more out of reach. But I'm like, I don't think Coca-Cola is a fundamental human right. There's no reason it should be subsidized. So as a result of this, when I was at my last company, we actually helped set a food policy. And we basically said, look, our company was going to basically subsidize healthy food in the form of a salad bar lunch and healthy meat and plant-based protein options. But you have personal choice. If you want to go out and eat, your sushi rito, you should absolutely go do that. If you want to bring in cookies and cakes, that's fine to do. We're not going to be judgmental about what you eat. But if you want to eat healthy, it's free. If you want to go out to eat, you pay for it. And I think that's the best policy when it comes to private organizations. And what ended up happening is the majority of people, what do? Of course, they come and they eat the free lunch, right? Why? Because it's cheap, it's free, it's right there, so you don't have to leave the workplace and get food. And then third, it's socially reinforced because you're hanging out with your colleagues and you're all eating together rather than when you go out to a restaurant, right? And so sort of that trifecta of incentives basically meant that I'd probably estimate 70 to 80% of people at work would just default to the easier option and eat healthy. And so I think this is a great policy, especially if you end up starting companies to be able to do this. There's obviously an expense in subsidizing food, but I think the ROI is pretty high, both in terms of recruiting employees and obviously in terms of saving in long-term health costs. So we talked a little bit about how addictive, social networking is and social factors are, and I want to talk a little bit about how that influences food. There's really some great research on how meal sizes change as a function of the day of the week and the number of people present. This is a research study that looked at this. So the interesting thing is if you look at how people eat during the week, you can see that bottom left chart, it's actually pretty stable. People are sort of eating between 2,100 to 2,200 calories. But then what happens for that big spike? That's called the weekend, right? And on the weekend, what do? We binge eat. We binge eat and we binge drink too, which is a big source of calories. Why? Because we're working really hard during the week, kind of feel encumbered, we want to party, you want to have a good time, you want to relax to de-stress, right? And so what happens when your average of calories is 2,150 calories, that goes up about 400, 500 calories more on Saturday. So you see that huge spike when people just kind of like get off work and they eat more. The other interesting phenomenon is you look at how many people you're eating with. Actually, it's sort of like a linear function in terms of eating more. So if you look at someone, for instance, who is eating alone, they're probably only eating about 1,800 calories a day. But if you eat with about 4 or more people, you're probably eating closer to 3,000 calories a day. What a profound difference that is, right? It's a little bit counterintuitive. You think sometimes people might be lonely eating alone and they're overeat, but if they're in the presence of others. But that doesn't seem to be the case. And so the researchers speculate the reason why that is actually because when you're in the presence of others, you just basically keep eating, right? You're hanging out, you're having a good time socially, and so you don't stop eating. So it might be an hour, it might be an hour and a half. But when you're eating by yourself, you're going to eat your food in about 15, 30 minutes and then go on your phone or go about your day, right? So it's less about the social influence, but more because we want to continue to hang out, we'll just basically continue to get seconds and thirds and so on. So given that we know that these things sort of influence how we eat, I was kind of sort of fancifully speculating, how could we actually use social networks for good instead of evil? I kind of think the cooking era is over. There's obviously going to be people who will cook, but I think cooking is going to be largely regarded as a hobby in the future, not as a staple that everyone does. I don't think most people cook probably anymore. And this is backed by data. If you actually ask people, there's only 10% of Americans love to cook. 45% hate cooking, the other 45% are lukewarm, right? And so instead of trying to motivate 90% of the population who are either lukewarm or hate cooking to start cooking again, right, losing battle, the idea I had was actually borrowing a little bit from Europe. So in certain parts of Europe, there's these things called supper clubs. And you can sort of join these supper clubs and you eat communally, right? So it's with a group of people. It could be anywhere from like 10 to 30 people. And they communally make food together, right? So you think about it like almost like a large extended family. And so you may only need to cook once every 2 weeks, right? Because that's sort of your turn. Or you're sort of helping out. It's a communal activity. You're not doing it by yourself. So costs go down, it's easier to do, and then you get the whole social benefit of eating at a nice long table with all your sort of friends that you see on a regular basis. And so the idea I had was, well, what if we increase the ability of those motivated 10% of people who love to cook, rather than focusing on the other 10%? And so, there's different ways of doing this, right? So this is a little bit more grassroots. We talked about sort of public policy, we talked about private organizations, but on an individual level, you could theoretically have an app that gets people who like to cook and basically says, why don't you host people for dinner? And we'll basically subsidize your food, right? So everyone who comes to your dinner is basically going to pay for your food, or literally will bring ingredients. You can pay people in cryptocurrency if you're a Bitcoin fan. And then the app could basically say, okay, within a 5-mile radius of your house, these are the 3 dinners that are hosted. And so if you don't have time to cook, you can go join these people, and you can, not eat by yourself. and probably eat healthy food. So, these are obviously, speculative ideas, but I think, social networks, especially local, hyper-local, real social networks can make a big difference in terms of getting people to change their behavior. That's beyond just asking for individuals to change their own. The other things that I see as a trend that I think are helping in the right direction is minimally processed foods. I like to joke they're bringing the sexy back to Whole Foods. So there's old examples of minimally processed foods. I mentioned sort of cheese, butter, yogurt, kefir. But you're seeing sort of this new wave of minimally processed foods as well. So pre-washed salad greens are a great example, right? They're like triple washed. You just literally take them out of the bag and you throw them on a plate. Pre-cut fruits and vegetables. Now there's these roasted flavored nuts and seeds. A commentator on my last article actually shared this as a picture. These are actually chickpeas and beans that have been cooked, roasted, and flavored, and they're in a snackable pack. But they're minimally processed, right? So other than basically being prepared and flavored, they're chickpeas, right? And so you're seeing more and more of these. My favorite example, though, are baby carrots. How many of you actually know that baby carrots are not young carrots? Yeah, they're actually deformed carrots. And the guy who invented them was actually an ex-Coca-Cola executive that felt so guilty about making people fat and sick that he decided to use behavior change technology for good. And essentially, they carved them down to make them snackable and appealing, because who wants to sit there and peel carrots in this day and age? Talk about behavior change. And when you do things like that and you put them in little individual serving sizes or these snack packs that have popped up in the last few decades, it's gotten people, especially kids, to eat healthier. And I think it's one of the best examples of using behavior change technology. Why? Because it's not trying to motivate people to eat carrots. It's not educating them on the benefits of beta-carotene. It's literally saying, look, we're going to make it easy. No more peeling carrots. They're bite-sized. They're crunchy. It has all this sort of the aesthetic things that gets people to eat them. And it makes it more likely for people to comply. The last thing I want to talk about is actually what I call Nutri-foods. And these are sort of foods, commentator suggested this and I actually really liked it. It's processed with purpose, right? So how can we process foods to actually, like for instance, make them nutritionally complete, given the amount of food nutritional deficiencies that people have? So these are essentially what are called fortified or functional foods. Where it can actually provide 100% of your recommended daily intake of vitamins or minerals. So these have actually been around for a long time. So the most common example is basically infant formula, right? So raising infants on breast milk is obviously superior, but if the mother cannot produce milk or is not at home, infant formula is a staple all around the world that ensures that infants have the nutrition that they need, and it's a very effective strategy in lieu of breast milk. There's also medical foods. I used to work in a burn ICU during my training, and so for people who have trouble swallowing, there are medical foods that enable them to live. And now, in more the consumer sphere, there's meal replacements. And so I actually think that things like these are helpful if you think about them less from a perspective of, is this the absolute best or optimal food, and think about them a little bit more as like a harm reduction strategy. So harm reduction is particularly used with substance abuse, right? Where there's models of sort of substance abuse treatment that are abstinence only, which is saying obviously like if you're an alcoholic you cannot touch alcohol ever. And then there are other strategies that are a little bit more flexible that are more in line with harm reduction, which is saying, okay, look, if you're going to use substances, and most people here, we have apparently very nice wine that's going to be out later tonight. Focus more on, not overdoing it and engaging in harm reduction and providing people with education, right? Another example of this is sort of sex education. There is abstinence-only sex education. Research shows largely ineffective. Why? People are going to engage in temptation. It's better to educate people and say, if you want to be abstinent, that's great, and you can do that. But if you're going to engage, here's how to keep yourself safe, right? And I think literally it's the same thing that we can do with food, right? Which is, yes, you should encourage people to eat healthy, whole foods as much as possible. But the reality is half of Americans regularly skip breakfast, and the half that do eat breakfast, a lot of them basically end up eating fast or junk food. So the question to me is a meal replacement better than an omelet? Probably not, but that's not the real comparison. The question is a meal replacement better than a Pop-Tart? which is probably what most people are eating when they're running out the door and eating food on the go, right? So we have to think about it in a little bit more of a realistic harm reduction strategy, which is probably getting people to avoid as much sugar as possible is the right way to go. And so as a result of that, I propose the realistic American diet, what I call going from sad to rad. And before I go into this, I want to talk about a colleague of mine, Dr. Sherry Pagoda, over at University of Massachusetts Medical School. She published an editorial in JAMA called A Call to the End to the Diet Debates. And there's so much debate going on. What's the best diet? Is it low fat? Is it low carb? Is it Whole30? Diets come and go. And if you actually look at the research literature, while there are statistically significant differences between some of the diets, obviously like the low carb research has been particularly strong recently, by far the biggest predictor is really compliance, right? Which is why we're all here, which is behavior change. And the mantra that I always preach is, whether that's in the companies I work with or the patients, is the best diet is the one that you can stick to long term, right? There is no optimal nutritional diet. The one that you can stick to the long term by far will outperform. So what I propose is, rather than telling everyone to go back to the ideal American diet, we need to be realistic about how people can eat. And so this is the proposal. This is the realistic American diet in 4 steps. So step number 1, of course, have as much whole foods as you are willing to eat and able to sustain, right? So right now, 1/3 of American calories come from whole foods. And I don't really think that's going to change, right? You got to kind of meet people where they're at. I have a great anecdote where I used to work with a lot of veterans in the VA system, and trying to get them to eat things like salad, it would be tough. They would call it rabbit food. And if people have that sort of perspective, you got to meet them where they're at, and you can't expect wholesale change when people have differing perspectives, right? A lot of the guys I work with, they're like, I'm a steak and potatoes man, right? It's kind of part of their identity. Step number 2 is choose better minimally processed foods, right? 10% of the diet right now is minimally processed foods, but it's hard to find good examples of that. If you actually go down, I was in the grocery store the other day, most of the yogurt is like low fat and high in sugar. It's very hard to find the opposite, which is low sugar, high in fat. And there's no reason for it, right? All the research recently supports the notion that total fat intake, including saturated fat, which we used to think was bad, is actually associated with a lower risk of death and stroke, right? So I think slowly food companies are going to change and start processing foods in better ways. And then third, we should of course tell people to limit unhealthy, ultra-processed junk food, or what I call junk food. But as much as they're able to do and is reasonable, right? Most people are not going to go from 57% of their diet down to 0, right? I think the most realistic thing, in my opinion, is for it to go down to maybe 10 to 20%. And the reason that's helpful from a behavior change perspective is, telling people to abstain altogether from chocolate and things that they love is very tough for people, right? But if at least you can cut it down to a minimal level, it's a lot more, I think, psychologically sustainable. And then finally, from a harm reduction perspective, whatever is left in your diet is literally, as a last resort, eat Nutri-Foods or sort of these healthy ultra-processed foods as a harm reduction strategy. So that's maybe 37%, 47% of the diet, right? And so the idea is really it's displacement, right? Is that obviously meal replacements are not as good as whole foods, but if you're not going to get people to be shaving down carrots any more than you currently are, the question is, can you at least get them to cut down on their Pop-Tarts and displace them with things that are less damaging to their bodies? And so in the spirit of that, there's been a lot of research done, actually, and it's unfortunate that this research doesn't get enough attention. So there was a follow-up study to the DPP. It's called the Look Ahead trial. It was essentially DPP 2.0 with patients that have type 2 diabetes. And this was the recommendation. So they actually replaced 2 of their meals, typically breakfast and lunch, with a liquid shake, and 1 snack with a bar. And they told them, okay, at least in the evening, though, eat conventional food. That even can be frozen food if you literally do not like cooking. Add some fruits and vegetables to your diet until you hit your daily calorie goal. After about 7 months, though, they tried to kind of like titrate people down a little bit and said, okay, wean down to about 1 meal replacement a day and reintroduce more regular foods, right? So this is a departure from the original study where they basically had people just handle their food on their own. But you can see the results are quite compelling. So they had people lose 8.6% of their weight loss after 1 year, and more importantly, they sustained 6% weight loss even after a decade. So if you remember from the original DBB clinical trial, they regained basically all the weight back, right? But in this trial, 6% at 10 years is actually a pretty impressive finding. And these people are pretty overweight, right? So they're starting out at 100 kilograms, which is, about 210 pounds. So 6% loss is pretty significant, probably around the order of about 12 pounds. So weight loss studies actually that use meal replacements consistently outperform weight loss studies that do not. And it's not that they're ideal, it's because it's a very effective behavior change strategy. And why is that? It's because it makes it easier for people, right? And so, because I wanted to practice what I preach, I started a consumer CPG company called Actualize, and it sells science-based foods and supplements. The problem that I saw in the market in working with people, and a lot of the participants that were going through a modest program were actually using shakes on their own. They were not recommended by the program, but they were desperate to find some easy, convenient solutions. And they're very high in carbohydrates, and low in fat, and just really based on outdated nutritional science. We literally couldn't find anything to recommend to people. And so I created Keto Meal. So it's in line with the ketogenic diet. You don't have to be on a ketogenic diet to use it, but it was basically formulated to have 2 grams of net carbs, 20 grams of protein, 18 grams of healthy fat for every 250 calories. So compare that to things in the market right now, like Soylent, that have 34 grams of net carbs and spike your blood sugar significantly. And so the idea behind this is, if you are the kind of person who doesn't eat breakfast or doesn't cook breakfast, you can have this as a healthy way to eat on the go, and you can rest assured that basically it's not going to affect your blood sugar levels, which obviously promotes insulin resistance and fat gain. And so, in conjunction with behavioral modification programs, I do think that we need to address the other side of the BJ Fogg equation, and also just find ways to make it easier for people. So finally, while technology is important, it's what we do with it that truly matters. I think the important thing to think about is, health behavior change is hard. Changing nutrition, changing exercise, these are difficult things to change. And so instead of trying to fight a losing war, one of the things that we're always trained as clinicians, and I train clinicians now, is whenever we run into patients that are difficult or difficult in the sense of, they're not changing or they're reluctant to change, we always tell people, roll with the resistance. So roll with the resistance is a mantra that comes from motivational interviewing and says, okay, if someone doesn't want to change and they're not ready to change or they're failing to change, you don't beat them over the head with it, right? You say, okay, well, let's meet you where you're at, kind of figure out what are you ready to do, and roll with it, right? And so I think the way forward for us as a community, particularly in digital health, is to leverage behavior change to technology to enhance convenience. And I think if we can do that, then we can enhance people's health. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Is this working? Yeah. Thank you so much, Cameron. That was wonderful, very enlightening. I especially liked your insight on how we can take examples from the tobacco industry and use some social and economic deterrents and apply it to the food industry. That was very interesting, and I really like the idea of the European supper clubs.
Absolutely.
I personally love to cook. I was sad to see only 10% of Americans like to cook.
One of those 10%. There you go.
Yeah. So we're going to ask just a few questions. One question I'd like to ask you as follow on to that amazing presentation is you recently wrote an article on your blog titled The Double-Edged Sword of Digital Health, the title of your article. You said that most digital health programs have lower effectiveness when deployed in the real world because digital health's greatest strength, accessibility, also inevitably lowers engagement rates. Could you share with us how so?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the funny thing is, when I was running behavioral diabetes management programs in VA hospitals, the biggest challenge that I had was just getting patients to come to treatment every week, right? They literally have to drive their car to the hospital every week. And that was the biggest barrier for compliance. And so the nice thing about technology is we said, okay, let's switch that paradigm around and let's bring treatment to patients, right? They can do it in the convenience of their own home, they can do it on their smartphone, they can do it on their computers, which basically opened the intervention to a lot more people. The thing that I think nobody really realized and we found is the funny thing about erecting barriers is that it basically serves as a pre-screener for motivation, right? Obviously you want to make your intervention as accessible to as many people as possible. But one of the things that I always try to explain is that the difference between medicine and psychology is that in medicine, the physician is the agent of change, right? The patient comes in, says, hey doc, I got a problem. The doctor's like, I have a pill or a procedure that can fix you, right? But as a psychologist, if the patient comes to me, I always tell people, I can't change you. I can only give you the knowledge, the skills, and the resources for you to change yourself, right? And so we actually don't, behavior change is not a something you do to anyone. They have to kind of meet the person where they're at. And so the challenge with technology is when you make things ultra accessible, where literally in 15 minutes while sitting in their living room they can sign up for a program, is that person may not be totally ready to change, right? They may realize that it's sort of in that contemplative stage of change that it would be beneficial for them, but they may not be ready to commit 5 hours a week or wake up, as I mentioned, 7:30 in the morning and go to the gym. But someone who is already driving to a hospital is probably farther along that motivational spectrum. So I think the challenge with digital health interventions is how do we balance that accessibility, but making sure that the right people are doing the intervention who actually have the motivation and can actually take advantage of it. And I think one thing that I haven't seen, and if someone wants to start a billion-dollar company, this is it, is how do you effectively use data to predict who would be a good candidate for a behavioral treatment. I think there's a lot of potential actually in using data science in doing that. We actually would try using, for instance, questionnaire data. There's like readiness to change questionnaires and say, you know, are you ready to change? Are you motivated to change? Are you confident that you'll change? And you know, guess what happens at the beginning of a program? People always say, yes, 10 out of 10, 10 out of 10, I'm super ready. And of course, they're not, right? They're just riding that initial wave of motivation. But there's a lot of predictors in terms of personality characteristics like conscientiousness. You can look at behavioral patterns of behavior that people are engaging in on social networks and use that to say, hey, if I put someone in this behavior change program, how likely are they to actually comply with it, take advantage of it, and benefit from it? And if you can do that, then the ROI of your intervention is going to be much, much higher, and you can charge more for it, and payers are going to be much more likely to pay for it. Because the worst thing you have is patients who sign up for your program and drop out, right? Nobody's happy. The patient's not happy, you're not happy, the payer's not happy.
Interesting, that makes sense. Thank you. Another question we have for you is, in the books like Nudge and the Power of Habit, which I know you mentioned, the authors discuss the power of social influencers, which are said to be effective in promoting healthy behaviors. How might entrepreneurs today take this research on social influencers and apply this behavior to change, to behavior change?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, we tried to do this at Amada, but basically using peer social influence, right? So we were trying to put people on level playing fields and use that to basically get people to look at people that might be in a group and say, hey, if she can do it, I can do it too. But I think the interesting thing is, you know, in the era of social media, you're seeing the whole rise of the influencer movement, where you have these basically internet celebrities, and they leverage their brands very powerfully, right? They can sell or promote their brands, sell products with it. But I think it's interesting, particularly if you're on Instagram, you see a lot of these health and fitness influencers, and they're also you know, leveraging their brands to get people to change too. So I think there's actually a lot of potential there in terms of, especially if you're focused more on the consumer side, of how do you sort of establish followership, because you know, celebrity is very influential. And people, if you're sort of like whether it's a Dr. Oz sort of academic celebrity or sort of like a fitness celebrity, you can engage with your users in a way that you never could before, where, you know, if it's like a TV personality, you'll never talk to that person. But you see sort of these micro-influencers rising up who have sort of maybe less than sort of 10 to 50,000 followers, and they communicate with their users on a regular basis, right? So like a great example of this is a guy named Possible Pat, a very obese guy, transformed himself, lost a ton of weight, now is like a personal trainer, uses Instagram to motivate people, but like literally like comments and engages with his users. And so the feedback and the connection that he has with this community is very powerful. And I think using the sort of that influencer aspect to drive behavior change is very powerful, because people always do want to see positive examples of change, and people do learn through modeling, and we know that from social psychology. And so if people can sort of show that it is possible, it can make a big influence on them as well.
Great, thank you, thank you. One of the other interesting topics that were discussed in the book, The Power of Habit, was the power of free will. So would you take a moment to elaborate on this, and how should entrepreneurs go about helping motivate someone to have the will to change their habits?
Yeah, my default gut reaction answer is you shouldn't. I mean, I think actually willpower is overrated. I think, as I mentioned sort of at the beginning of my talk, trying to increase someone's motivation. I mean, there are techniques to do so. As I mentioned, there is motivational interviewing, but motivational interviewing, when you're doing it in a clinical setting, usually takes a few sessions. You kind of have to meet people where they're at, and you can only sort of move someone who's at like a 1 out of 10, maybe like a 5 out of 10. Obviously, education using these techniques can be helpful, but I think what's more effective is to use an increase in motivation at the right time point, right? You're not going to motivate someone and sustain that motivation for years. What I think you can do, though, is to motivate people at the right time to basically sign up for your program or engage in a behavior that has long-term consequences, right? So I'll give you a couple examples. You show a very inspirational, motivational video that says, hey, here's our app, here's our product, and this is why you should sign up. It may boost their motivation for 5 minutes, but that's all you need to get them to basically put in their information and make an account, right? And so you're leveraging that. The other example of that is people who get really motivated around January 1st, sign up for a gym membership, and maybe the compliance with that isn't so great, but sometimes if you're signing up for a 2-year gym membership, that like 5 days of motivation has long-term consequences. And so sometimes people actually do end up going to the gym more often because they basically prepaid for the whole thing, or they signed up for a bunch of personal training sessions, and that makes it longer term. So I think if you leverage motivation in a way that has long-term consequences, which is usually around signing up for something that's not easily reversible, then even though it's sort of a transient phenomenon, it can have longer-term implications.
Great, thank you. And last question. What is your vision for digital health in the next 5 to 15 years?
Oh man, that's a big question. I should ask the audience that. One of the things that I've seen is, I think in the generations of companies, my last company came out of the first class of Brock Health, and we've seen sort of subsequent classes come up. I think they sort of represent what I call digital health 1.0, in that a lot of the companies were basically translations of existing diagnostics or therapeutics to an online setting, right? You take a clinical trial like the DPP, or you take an evidence-based treatment like CBT, and then you basically just digitize it. You create an online version of it that's even more accessible. But it's not a fundamental innovation or transformation of the technology, right? It's more about making that intervention accessible to a wider number of people. Online DPP is not more effective than in-person DPP. It's comparably effective, right? What I think is going to happen in Digital Health 2.0 is it's going to be less translations of in-person treatments and more sort of what I call digitally native treatments that take advantage of fundamental advances in computer science or electrical engineering to literally create treatments that look nothing like what we do now, right? So for instance, like the whole psychotherapy model of like you come for an hour a week and you see your therapist is largely a function of that's probably the most reasonable expectation that you can get someone to drive and see you for an hour a week, right? But what if it wasn't an hour session and that's a function of how we bill through our insurance system, where it's an always on thing, maybe there's sort of micro points of contact where it's all throughout the week and doesn't look anything like the way that we engage today. So I think these sort of fundamentally innovative treatments that were designed specifically for digital platforms are going to be the next wave of technologies that especially use AI, that use ML as sort of the underpinning of what they're doing.
That's great. Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you very much.
My pleasure.